Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, or Braun and Clarke's Reflexive Thematic Analysis. Which one should you choose? You've picked your topic, you know you want to do qualitative research, and now you're stuck on the question that nobody warned you about. What to do with your qualitative data? Like, how do you actually analyse it? For many students doing qualitative research, it often comes down to two choices: Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, or IPA, or Braun and Clarke's Reflexive Thematic Analysis, RTA. They both involve coding, they both involve themes, but underneath the surface, they are very different. Choosing the wrong one can lead to messy data, an unclear write-up, and a very confused examiner. In this video, we're going to break down the key differences between IPA and TA, and hopefully you'll be able to figure out which one suits you best. If we've not met before, hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I'm here to help you realise that there is no big secret when it comes to finishing your PhD. It's simply a process of small steps, one after the other. I'm here to help you identify the next one and keep you moving forward. Because you can do this. You can. If at the moment you are trying to choose between RTA and IPA, you're in the right place. So let's get into it. Now, let's be honest, RTA and IPA do look quite similar at first glance. Both of them analyse qualitative data. Both of them involve coding and themes. Both are interpretive. Both ask you to reflect on your role as the researcher. But these similarities sit at the surface, because what RTA and IPA are trying to do and how they go about doing it are fundamentally different. RTA, Reflexive Thematic Analysis, is all about trying to identify patterns of meaning across a data set. You are actively constructing themes that are going to help you answer your research questions. Themes do not emerge, they are not hiding there in the data, waiting for you to discover them. You are building them, you are constructing them. RTA works really well if you're studying things like perceptions, attitudes, cultural or social discourse, experiences across a group, how people talk about something. And in terms of paradigms, you can use RTA within a number of different paradigms, but Braun and Clarke originally envisaged it for an interpretivist paradigm. Think of RTA like storytelling with structure. You're crafting themes to help your reader make sense of what's going on in the data. You are helping tell the story of that data. On the other hand, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, or IPA, that's all about understanding how people make sense of specific experiences in their lives. It's rooted in phenomenology, the study of lived experience, hermeneutics, interpretation, and ideography, focusing deeply on the individual. You're not summarising people's experiences. You're exploring what those experiences meant to your participants and how they made sense of them. And then crucially, there's something called the double hermeneutic. And this is about how you make sense of them making sense. So there's understandings of two sense-making processes going on here. Your own sense-making and the participant's sense-making, hence double hermeneutic. Think of IPA like zooming in with a magnifying glass. You are slowly getting closer. You are seeing things more clearly as you peel back those layers, as you get closer to the participant's experience. And you need to do that before you can cautiously build some broader insights. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. Firstly, women returning to work after maternity leave. If you're doing reflexive thematic analysis, or RTA, you might ask, what themes emerge across women's experiences of returning to work after maternity leave? And here you'd be exploring shared patterns, things like stress, support systems, flexible working, identity conflict, etc. You're looking across participants to find the common threads. In interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA on the other hand, you'd be asking, how does a woman make sense of her return to work after maternity leave? And what does that mean for her identity as a mother and a professional? So this is about deeply understanding personal meanings, how these women experience that transition, how they narrate it, how they tell the story of it. Let's look at another example now. Here we're looking at the example of living with a chronic illness. If you're coming at this from an RTA or reflexive thematic analysis perspective, you might ask, what are the common challenges and coping strategies described by people living with chronic fatigue syndrome? The focus here is on identifying repeated patterns across the accounts. So what shows up again and again? What themes can you build from this data? If you're using Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis or IPA, you might ask, how does a person living with chronic fatigue syndrome make sense of their changing body and daily challenges? Now what you're doing is you are zooming in to understand one person's lived, contextualized and interpreted experience, and that double hermeneutic, your interpretation of their interpretation. Reflexive thematic analysis essentially asks the question, what is going on across this data set? Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis, or IPA, asks the question, what does this mean to this person and how do they make sense of it? Before we get into the next part, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you already made a choice between IPA and RTA, or are you still stuck? Are you still struggling to choose between the two? Let's talk about it, because your comment might help somebody else who's in exactly the same spot, so get typing. And whilst you're down there, if you love our videos and want to support the channel, you can put a few pennies in our virtual tip jar by clicking on this thanks option right here. Both RTA and IPA ask you, as the researcher, to reflect on your role in the research, but they do so in slightly different ways. In RTA, you are actively involved in the construction of themes. Your subjectivity is not a flaw. It is very much embraced as part of this approach. And you are very transparent, very explicit in acknowledging any biases, any assumptions, anything that is going to be informing how you go about generating those themes. Similarly, in IPA, you're also thinking about what you're bringing to the table and how that's impacting the analysis. But there is a much stronger emphasis on staying grounded in the participant's world. It is a very delicate dance between your insights and their insights. It's that double hermeneutic again. You are interpreting their interpretation, and that is something that takes time, that takes patience and a lot of nuance. Let's put this into one of those example projects. Let's take a look at living with chronic illness. In reflexive thematic analysis, or RTA, your goal is to construct shared themes across participants, like loss of control or shifting identity. Let's say that you've got a background in health research. That might lead you to notice clinical narratives more easily and potentially overlook emotional or social meanings. Now in RTA, that is part of your role, to reflect on those biases and explain how they shape your interpretation. So you might say something like, my training in health psychology led me to initially prioritise medically framed coping strategies. Through reflexive journaling, I realised I was underplaying emotional themes, which I later revisited and coded with greater nuance. In Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, IPA on the other hand, you dive deeply into one participant's lived experience of chronic illness, and you'd focus on how they made sense of their changing body. So let's say a participant says, I wake up feeling like I'm in someone else's skin. Now, as a researcher, your task is to interpret that metaphor within their context and be really conscious of how your lack of lived experience of that, or your own assumptions, might shape your interpretation of it. So you might say something like this. Not living with a chronic illness myself, I had to carefully interrogate my interpretation of this metaphor. I returned to the transcript multiple times to stay grounded in the participant's language and avoid overlaying my own assumptions. The number of participants that you plan to include in your research can make or break a choice one way or the other between IPA and RTA. RTA can be used with 10, 15, 30 participants, depending obviously on the nature of the data and your research question. But the main thing about RTA is that it's scalable. You can scale it up. In IPA, on the other hand, the sample is very deliberately small. And a typical sample size, it might be 3 participants up to 6 participants. especially at PhD level. And why is that? That is because you go deep. You spend hours and hours and hours in each transcript. You explore identity, emotion, values, cultural context, all within that one transcript. So if your goal is depth over breadth, then IPA might be better for you. But if you want to look across experiences and identify commonalities, RTA might be the way to go. Now, in terms of what the analysis looks like, RTA, Reflexive Thematic Analysis, follows Braun and Clarke's 6 steps. Now, I go into a lot more detail about each of these individual steps in my overview video, which I'll pop up on the screen right now. But for now, let's just have a brief overview. You start with step 1, which involves familiarising yourself with the data. Then in step 2, you get on with generating some initial codes. Step 3 is constructing themes. Step 4 is reviewing those themes. Step 5 is when you're really nailing it down, you're defining and naming those themes. And step 6 is writing up your findings. And you're doing all this reflexively. You are bringing your own lens and your own interpretation to the data, and you're being transparent about that. So you're taking your data, which might be interview transcripts, and you are summarising it, you are labelling it, you are coding it. You're looking at what's meaningful in that data, and then you're constructing themes around it. And themes are those central organising concepts that help you tell the story of that data, that help you categorise that data, that help you make sense of it. Your aims are richness, coherence, and transparency. Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, or IPA, is much more detailed, much more layered. Taking it step by step, you firstly read and then reread a transcript. You secondly note the interesting features about that transcript, so emotion, metaphor, contradiction. After that, you identify themes within a particular case, which might be a particular participant. You then repeat that process for all of your participants, and then you cautiously draw connections across the cases. And it doesn't stop at describing, because you're interpreting. So if a participant says, crossing that marathon finish line felt like being reborn, you're asking, why that metaphor? What role does that moment play in their life narrative? And how do context, culture, and identity shape the meaning here? So which one should you choose? Here are 3 questions to help you decide. Firstly, what are you trying to understand? If it's patterns of meaning across the data set, then RTA might be the one for you. If it's individual meaning making and experiences, it might be IPA. Secondly, what kind of sample are you working with? If it's 10 plus participants, you might be better suited to RTA. If it's between 3 and 6 participants, you might be looking at IPA. And thirdly, how comfortable are you with philosophical depth? If you want a bit of flexibility, if you want to be philosophical but you don't have to be, it might be worth looking at RTA. On the other hand, IPA requires engagement with phenomenology, with hermeneutics, and the ability to interpret those interpretations. So if that sounds more appealing to you, perhaps take a look at that. Let's say, for example, you're studying students with ADHD. RTA might help you to explore what themes emerge in how students with ADHD describe their learning environment. IPA would help you explore, on the other hand, how do individual students with ADHD make sense of their academic journeys, and what does that diagnosis mean for their identity? If you like this video and you're all about qualitative methods, you should probably go and check out the one appearing on your screen right now. It's going to be really helpful in writing up your methodology chapter, especially the parts when you are defending a qualitative approach and you're explaining why that was the most appropriate one for you. It covers what you should be writing and what you absolutely should not be writing as a qualitative researcher. So go and check that out. I'll see you in there.